All right, well, it's about 7:01 Central Time, so I think we can go ahead and get started.
34.
Glad to have everybody here joining us tonight. Looks like we're over 30 at the moment. The St. Louis chapter of Americans United is very happy to host this event. I'm Cynthia Holmes, the local president, joined by Hal Harris, one of our other officers. And we're pleased to have Rachel Laser and Richard Katskee joining us. We had planned to have a big St. Louis chapter event at the Missouri History Museum in April of 2020. And so you guys know how that didn't turn out. We like to brag. We believe the St. Louis chapter is the oldest chapter of Americans United because we were started in about 1949. So within a year or two of the national. We're very pleased to have with us Rachel and Richard. I was just mentioning to them before we signed on that their biographies are so impressive that it would take quite a while to read them. So I encourage all of you to do so sometime. But briefly, Rachel Laser is our CEO and president. She's an attorney. She's a graduate of Harvard and the University of Chicago Law School. She has held a lot of positions. She was a deputy director for the Religious Action Center for Reform Judaism. As a member of minority religion, she understands the importance of freedom of conscience for everybody, both people of faith and people with no religion. She was senior counsel at the National Women's Law Center. She's done a lot of coalitioning, putting together groups, religious and otherwise, for all sorts of justice issues. And Rachel, we're very pleased. We were wondering when Barry Lynn retired about a successor, and you have certainly filled that bill. Probably not his big shoes, but your own. We're also pleased to have Richard Katskee. Richard's our legal director. Richard has served in many capacities in the legal education field. I think he's currently at George Washington or Georgetown, maybe. He has, I'm trying to flip to his bio as we speak, gang, so stick with me. Richard, I think I'm going to come back to your biography at the end of your
Totally
talk.
fine.
Because I've lost
That's great.
I've lost it. So yeah, so we've had an election. I assume everybody understands or knows about that. We've got a new administration. We will be getting probably different kinds of judges with them, and the same challenges that we have been left with, given the judiciary and some of the politics. And so I know we all want to hear from Rachel. Rachel, why don't you let us have your thoughts post-election and where we go from here?
Yeah, thanks, Cynthia. And I just have to start by saying that given that we're in this moment of, quarantining and isolation for so long now, it's hard to believe, from COVID-19, and also what we've all just been through for the past 4 years on our issue, that I'm especially appreciative right now to be with family, and in community with you all. It feels really good. So this actually, from my perspective, is falling at a great moment. And I'm so glad that we could all be together. And Cynthia, this has been a long time coming. And I've been really looking forward to speaking with you and also hearing from you and the chapter folks and those who now can join us virtually from wherever. Hi, Steph. About what you're thinking about as well. So I wanted to thank you, Cynthia, for your many years of leadership on behalf of Americans United in keeping religion and government separate. I deeply appreciate it. Personally, I appreciate it on behalf of AU. We all appreciate you. We appreciate this strong chapter. And I also wanted to say that after I speak briefly, because I really want Richard to be able to tell you all some of our thoughts around our legal strategy, which are still burgeoning and actively taking shape, and about some of our legal cases, that I definitely do want to allow time to make sure that we hear from you all and have a conversation. So yeah, you had originally said, why don't you talk to them a little bit about some of the challenges and some of the opportunities of the moment, that we're in. And I think, firstly, I want to say I'm grateful that you included opportunities, right? Because even saying that is sort of like a newer gloss on sort of how we're accustomed to thinking, right? It's like the challenges, the challenges. But there really are both right now. And this organization has a plan to take advantage of the opportunities in addition to deal with the challenges, which I'm really proud of. And the board and staff have worked really hard on that plan. So I just want to reassure you all that those are exactly the right questions to ask, Cynthia, I think. And let me say a few things about the challenges and a few things about the opportunities that I see right now, and then I'll turn it over to Richard, and then we'll all talk. So in this past year, I read this book, and it was like only okay. Actually, I don't know if any of you read it, but the title of it comes to mind. It was called Little Fires Everywhere. I don't know if any of you read it, but I'd actually amend that title to describe this moment and say Big Fires Everywhere. But that's really sort of one of the biggest challenges that we're facing right now. From the continued contamination of water in Flint, Michigan, to real threats right now to reproductive freedom, given what the Supreme Court has serving as our 9 justices, to the racism problem that's been uncovered for many white people in this country, that's taking Black and brown people's lives. There's a lot of urgency right now around a lot of things. Religious freedom is 100% one of them, and our issue is connected to all the things I just talked about, right? We're connected to science. We're connected to reproductive freedom. We're connected to LGBTQ equality, and of course to countering Christian nationalism, whose underbelly, I think, the underbelly of this this movement to redefine religious freedom and what it's really about, I think has really come to light a lot in these past 4 years. But nonetheless, we're dealing with incredible competition. Add to that the Democrats' classic sort of problem of worrying about coming across as being anti-religion or not religious enough, or anti-God, getting labeled as being Marxist and communist and anti-God. And, that's something that sometimes makes Democrats want to pander to religious extremists on this issue of religious freedom and religious exemptions. And sometimes, it makes them want to sort of give on it in order to sort of prove their religious bona fides, right? And, you hear little glimpses of it even already, just little glimpses. I'm thrilled that we have a change in administration. We'll talk about this under opportunities. Biden has some really positive things in his record. And of course, actions speak louder than rhetoric, but I'm sure I'm not the only one who caught the sort of heavy religious rhetoric and of his victory speech. If any of you listened to it, and lots of references to God, and not in every instance sort of going out of his way to be inclusive. So I think we're going to be we're in a much better moment, but we're going to still face some of these classic problems that we do when Democrats have more power. Sorry, I had written down. I didn't want to make myself out to be sour on Biden when it comes to this issue. I mean, he really does, like in his platform, he talks about making sure that religious freedom isn't misused to turn back the clock on LGBTQ equality. Um, he, his political stances on reproductive freedom have been good. He said he doesn't want to impose his personal views on people. And there's this great line from a 2005 interview, granted it was a long time ago, where he said, this is a quote, "This is a nation founded on the idea of the separation of church and state. After 200 years, why the hell would you want to go messing with that?" So that was good. So we're optimistic, but we're just not naive, right? So that's sort of a challenge. The courts in general are a challenge, and I will save that for Richard to speak with you more about, but no doubt that's a real challenge of the moment. This whole redefinition of religious freedom that has really begun to stick, unfortunately, right? That somehow religious freedom is unfettered free exercise of religion, right? Like, forget about the Establishment Clause part, which also protects everybody's religious freedom. Just, forget about what Ruth Bader Ginsburg always put in her dissents, right? That your right to swing your arms ends at the tip of the other man's nose. Forget about all that. Just that somehow this notion that if every single person in this country doesn't have the ability to act on their beliefs, they're being discriminated against, even if they're causing harm to other people and using it as a disguise, really, to discriminate still. A group of Stanford students visited me on their spring break last year, and I focus grouped them. What do you first think of when you think about religious freedom? And they all agreed they thought of anti-LGBTQ. I mean, that's sad, right? Like, that says something about this sort of takeover of the term. So I think that's a real challenge. And, finally, just another challenge is that all of us, I think, in many ways are kind of exhausted. This has been a lot that we've been through emotionally on our issue. I know the staff of 35, so talented, so amazingly dedicated at Americans United, are physically exhausted, right? It's been like thing after thing after thing that we've been dealing with for 4 years. And, I come on board and I'm like, oh, and let's add this whole proactive agenda on top of all of that. Richard's like laughing because otherwise he'd probably be crying. So, I mean, it's a lot. It's a lot. And there is like a level of exhaustion. So there's that. Okay, opportunities. Sorry, I don't want to take up too much time. I'm going to move through this. We have an unbelievable opportunity to grow and strengthen our movement, to mobilize younger people, to reach a more diverse group of people. We did this poll for the first time last year. Americans United had never done our own public opinion research, and I think we should be doing it every year. That should be an area of our expertise since we know the issues so well. But we did a really comprehensive poll. It was great. And the poll, and I was sort of wondering what the poll results would reveal. But one of the things I'm really happy to report out is 60% of Americans said that keeping religion and government separate was either one of the most important things to them personally or very important. So that was great. But only a fifth of Americans thought that there was any like real serious urgency around our issue, right? It's like, what if most of the people still think that in 1785 we kind of we set ourselves up and we're fine, and like that. So that's been, I think, a problem for this movement for a very long time. I think an opportunity is in the past 4 years, as I said, like the underbelly's been exposed, this constant misuse of it to discriminate against LGBTQ people, against women, against religious minorities, against non-believers. It's been like this steady beat, this steady theme. And even if you're not like a wonky person and you've missed this steady stream of regulations that have impeded healthcare access, impeded access to employment, impeded access to social services, hurt kids in foster care who are in need of qualified parents who can't foster because they're the wrong religion or they don't meet the religious litmus test. Even if you've missed that all, you have profoundly felt the strengthening of a Christian nationalist movement in this country. And I don't see who could miss the dog whistle to his Christian nationalist base when Trump tear gassed a bunch of anguished protesters who were upset and mourning the murder of George Floyd to walk to St. John's Church and brandish that upside down Bible, right? I mean, there have been lots of moments like that. The Evangelical Only Advisory Board, the constant pandering. Another opportunity to grow and strengthen our movement, besides like the urgency that's been more pronounced, is that we have changing demographics in this country, right? And one of the changing demographics is, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it, the rise of the nuns, Nones, right? The non-religious, right? 40% of millennials are non-religious. That's a lot, And so, with these changing demographics and the religious diversity in our country, right? White Christians ceased being a majority in this country in 2014. Right. So that's a challenge because of all the fear that that's engendered. But that's also an opportunity because religious freedom is really valued by a lot of us who want to make sure that it's not just one religious set of views that are privileged. Right. So that's working in our favor. We have an opportunity not just to grow our movement, but to grow our financial strength and to fundraise. That's real. Right. So like one of our biggest opponents, you probably know of them, is a group called Alliance Defending Freedom. They're the ones who brought that Masterpiece Cake Shop case about the Colorado bakery, turning away the gay couple, Charlie Craig and David Mullins, who wanted the wedding cake. Remember that case? So they brought it. So they're really anti-LGBTQ, sort of misusing religious freedom to discriminate group. Their annual funding is $50 million a year, right? And we're like a little over a fifth of that. So we really do need, to grow our financial strength and power, and we are. And lastly, for our opportunities, other than sort of growing our strength and our movement, we're in this critical moment of self-examination, that like the kind of moment that only comes from having been through some stuff, like liken it to someone who, like, I liken it, okay, I'm a woman, I'm married, I'm now getting older, I'm 51 now, okay, so it's like, all right, it's sort of like I've been in this horrendous relationship for these past years. I love my husband, but it's like I've been in this horrendous relationship. All of a sudden I wake up and I'm like 75. Well, Americans United is turning 75 in 2022. I'm so proud of us and all that we are, but it's like, we've been through a lot and we're not always winning. A lot of federal dollars, a lot went directly to fund clergy salaries through the CARES Act and the stimulus package, and went to fund religious schools, right? The court, the court has ruled against us in everything from vouchers to growing this religious freedom exception for religious schools, the ministerial exception, to refusing to find that there was an establishment clause problem with the religious exemptions for birth control for all bosses in this country. So we've been through it, but with that comes like this moment to really step back and like assess, like, where are we? Who are we going to be for the next 75 years? What kind of long-term thinking do we need to do? Like, what laws do we need to pass? What constitutional amendments do we need to pass? How do we make sure that our bench, our federal bench, is built with nominees that understand and value our issue, right? So these are all really important questions for us to be asking. And we are taking advantage of this moment to step back, to look at that. We're rebranding because we have to. We're 75 years old. We've barely rebranded ever in a serious way. We're rebranding carefully, not to lose people who are with us, but how to become modern and make sure that we're reaching new people, right? We're doing racial equity work, right? If this movement stays as white as we are, we're in trouble, right? We are in trouble. And also, we're not seeing the full reach of our issue. Right? I give a whole speech. I gave it this morning at 11 o'clock on the connection between church-state separation and racial equity, right? And how when it's undermined, it's often to advance racist policy and white supremacist policy. So we have tremendous opportunity to step back, to rebrand, to do a long-term think and to set ourselves up for another 75 years of success. So I'm sorry that I spoke too long already. I'm going to turn it over to my amazing colleague, Richard, who I know has a lot to say about our legal cases, the courts, and our legal strategy. Over to you.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Cynthia and Hal and all of you. I'm so pleased to have the chance to talk with you a little bit tonight. I wish it were in person, not just because I love St. Louis, but also because that way you wouldn't hear my kids screaming in the background, which you surely will. So let me apologize in advance for that. I'm going to start with talking about judicial appointments and the composition of the federal courts, which, yeah, I know it's a topic only a lawyer could love, but I think it's really important. Now, when President Obama left office after 8 years, there was a huge number of judicial vacancies on the federal courts because the Senate under Mitch McConnell had been slowing judicial appointments to an absolute crawl for years, starting way before there was media attention because of refusing to hold a confirmation hearing for Merrick Garland for appointment to the Supreme Court. It was just the way of doing things. Do it as little give as few hearings as possible, let the vacancies pile up on the courts for fear that there would be judges that McConnell didn't like. Oh, but despite that, we finally, after those 8 years, and we'd finally gotten back, probably for the first time since about the Carter administration, to what most legal experts on the left and on the right thought of as something approaching balance on the bench. Now, the Supreme Court was identifiably quite conservative. There's no question about that. But it was hard to call the lower federal courts either conservative or progressive, either right or left, because most of the time and in most places. So as a lawyer, as a litigant, you felt like you had a reasonable shot at getting judges who would give you a fair hearing, whatever side you were on. You might not win, but you didn't feel like things were stacked in either direction. Again, doesn't mean that they were so favorable to us, but it means that they were okay. And by the way, on church state issues, because we at Americans United do really careful, precise legal work, we were extraordinarily successful with Republican as well as Democratic appointed judges. I think that's because there had been a basic understanding that at minimum, nominees to be federal judges really ought to be good, careful, serious lawyers. They might be on the left, they might be on the right, but for the most part, they were expected to appreciate the proper role of judges in courts and to care about things like the rule of law, go figure, the Constitution. So in most of our cases, and by the way, some of our biggest victories, some of the successes of which I'm most proud in my now more than a decade and a half with Americans United, they came and still come from judges appointed by George W. Bush, his dad, Ronald Reagan, you name it. What's more, every president since Jimmy Carter had worked to increase diversity on the federal bench. More women, more people of color, attempts to make the federal bench start to reflect some of the diversity in the legal profession and the nation. It was slow progress, to be sure, but the trend line was always going the right way. Then along comes Donald Trump. You know that he appointed 3 of the 9 Supreme Court justices, but he's also appointed almost a third of the judges on the federal courts of appeals and a quarter of the judges on the federal trial courts, 220 federal judges and justices in all out of the 870 spots that are available. And by the way, he has some more nominations that Mitch McConnell is trying to push through the Senate right now before January 20th. So who are these Trump appointed judges? 76% are men, even though for years, law schools across the country have been graduating more women than men, and more women have been entering the profession. 85% of his appointees are white, not exactly reflecting the country. What about qualifications? Qualifications to be a judge. Well, the American Bar Association does a nonpartisan review of all nominees to the federal courts to determine who has the knowledge and experience and temperament to be a federal judge. It's not based on their policies. It's not based on their politics. It's based on, are you somebody who can be expected to do the job properly and take it seriously? The ABA rated a bunch of the Trump nominees as unqualified. That's the official rating. Now, just a handful of those withdrew their names from consideration. One after he was humiliated during his confirmation hearings by not being able to answer basic legal questions that, frankly, any first-year law student should have known the answers to. Another one, when it started to get awkward for the White House to explain this nominee's statements about things like how transgender children are part of Satan's plan. But I'll tell you, otherwise, even the folks rated as unqualified and publicly recognized as such in their communities by judges and lawyers across the political spectrum, they were still confirmed. No surprise, really, because they were chosen for purely ideological reasons. And in many cases, that was specifically because of their animosity toward church-state separation. Now, don't get me wrong. Not all the Trump appointees are extreme ideologues who don't care about upholding the law. But the White House worked really hard to get judges who were likely to advance a distorted view of religious liberty that would erase the Establishment Clause, curtail church-state separation, let religious objectors get out of following basic anti-discrimination laws, and roll back civil rights protections, hard-fought civil rights protections, especially for reproductive freedom, LGBT people, and people of color. And by the way, the Trump judges and justices, they're young. When the framers of the Constitution set up life tenure for federal judges, their expectation was that the federal judges would be drawn from the most distinguished lawyers and state court judges, people who had a lifetime of experience and knowledge. And of course, life expectancy at that time wasn't so long. So if you were one of those folks at the top of the legal profession and appointed to be a federal judge, life tenure might be 5 years, 10 if you were lucky. Trump's latest appointment to the Supreme Court, Amy Coney Barrett, she's 48. And he's appointed plenty of people to the federal courts of appeals who are in their early and mid 30s. So they could easily have 30 or 40 or frankly, even 50 years on the bench to pursue the agenda they were selected for. You get the point. These are tough times for our cases and issues, and things are going to be likely to stay that way for decades. But I'll tell you, that doesn't mean, you shouldn't take it to mean that there's no hope. What it does mean is that the work is getting harder and we have to be more strategic, and we also have to look for things, for avenues other than the courts as well. So now, look, let me tell you about some of the cases we have going on now to give you an idea of the issues that are before the courts, what we think are important and what we're pursuing. First, Rachel mentioned foster care, and I want to tell you about 2 cases on foster care. Now, kids in the foster care system are legally in the custody of the state, whatever state you live in. So the state has legal duties to care for them. It is not adoption. It's not like adoption agencies. It's typically when the state comes in and takes kids out of a dangerous, neglectful, abusive family situation, something like that. We represent Amy Madonna, a wonderful mom in South Carolina. Amy wanted to help needy foster kids. So she went to the agency that South Carolina hires and pays to run a big chunk of the state's foster care program using federal and state tax dollars. Amy and her husband and kids went through the whole process of being investigated and approved and all that good stuff. And they passed by with flying colors till the person from this agency said, okay, one last thing. What church do you belong to? And Amy said, well, it's Our Lady of Grace, which is a Catholic church in Greensboro, because the family is Catholic. Oops, sorry, no good. We don't do Catholics. And it's such a shame because otherwise you would have been perfect, just the sort of person people we look for to be a foster family. You see, the organization hired by the state to find and approve foster parents is Evangelical Protestant. That's fine. But the folks there believe that if you aren't an Evangelical Protestant, you're unfit and can't be trusted with kids. So they rejected Amy, meaning that a needy kid doesn't get a good, loving home because the Madonnas are the wrong religion. We also represent Bryn Esplin and Fatma Maroof, who are a married same-sex couple in Dallas, who wanted to help refugee kids in federal custody by being foster parents. In Texas, the organization that has a contract with the federal government to run the program to take refugee kids and try to get them into foster homes happens to be a Catholic organization. So Bryn and Fatma went to them, but this organization rejected them because as a same-sex couple, they were told they don't mirror the Holy Family. So in both of those cases, we're suing and we're asking the courts to recognize that those who are hired by the government to certify people as foster parents can't discriminate. They have to do the job that the government hires them for, and they shouldn't be able to apply their own religious criteria to exclude wonderful, loving, caring people who just want to help needy children. I'm quite hopeful about those cases. I feel really good, not just about the fact that we're doing them, but about the direction that they're heading. But I do have to tell you, there's a case in the Supreme Court right now that was argued earlier this month, a couple of weeks ago, that's worrisome. It's called Fulton against City of Philadelphia, and you might have read something in the paper about it. Philadelphia hires organizations, including religious ones, to investigate and certify foster parents. That's like what goes in the two cases we have that I told you about. The difference, though, is that when Philadelphia learned that two of those religious agencies wouldn't work with or approve same-sex couples, it didn't renew their contracts. You see, Philadelphia has a law saying that prospective foster parents can't be rejected or disfavored or treated differently because of their race or religion or sexual orientation. So the agency's job is to investigate and determine without discriminating whether the prospective foster parents are qualified to provide a safe, caring home, kind of what you'd expect. One of those organizations, when its contract didn't get renewed, it sued Philadelphia, saying that the free exercise clause gives it, get this, a constitutional right to get that contract to do the state's work of investigating and certifying foster parents, and a constitutional right to do that job according to its religious beliefs rather than following the law. I got to tell you, I'm nervous about what the Supreme Court is going to do. I fear that it's going to narrow the rights of prospective foster parents and people who go to participate in state and federal programs generally, not to be discriminated against, supposedly to protect the religious freedom of the contractor getting paid to do the government's work. That is not what religious freedom is supposed to be. And frankly, not that long ago, any move of the law in that direction would have been thought crazy, unthinkable. Now, it's likely. I think that we will still win our cases. I genuinely do. And I feel, as I said, I feel really good about them. But what the Supreme Court does in Fulton will very likely create some major hurdles, make it really much harder to get there, and to deter other people from making similar challenges. Okay. Now, two cases we have on behalf of teachers who are employed by religious schools. We represent a wonderful science teacher who taught at a Christian school where there was a terrible, terrible climate of racism. How bad? Well, kids would routinely shout the N-word at school, and they would come to school in KKK robes. The teacher was a target of that because though he himself is white, he has an adopted child who's Black. So in response to what was going on, the teacher did what you would expect a good teacher to do. He put together an assembly to try to teach the kids that racism is, bad. He got fired for it. We also represent a terrific counselor at a Catholic school who grew up in the community, attended that school herself, and went back and worked there for years. She's beloved by the students and parents alike. but she got fired when the diocese learned that she's married to a woman. Now, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act is the federal law prohibiting employment discrimination in what's called a hostile work environment based on race, as well as sex and religion and some other things. This past June, in a case called Bostock versus Clayton County, the Supreme Court held that Title VII also bars employment discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. A wonderful, wonderful ruling. So both of our teachers should have had the right not to be fired, because one, it was about race, and the other, it was about sexual orientation. But in that opinion, in that otherwise really good opinion in the Bostock case, the Supreme Court specifically left open the possibility that if an employer has a religious basis for discriminating, that might exempt it from the law barring employment discrimination based on sexual orientation. And then about 2 weeks later, the Supreme Court decided another case. This one's called Our Lady of Guadalupe against Morrissey Baru, which says that that employment discrimination laws don't apply when religious institutions hire and fire what are called ministerial employees, which is supposed to mean people who teach and preach the faith, like clergy. They get freedom to decide on that, but it's not supposed to apply to other folks. Now, Rachel mentioned the group Alliance Defending Freedom. That group put out a handbook and distributed it to religious institutions nationwide, advising them on how they could try to have all their employees, not just the clergy, not just the teachers, but the clerks and the janitors and everybody else, considered as ministers. The handbook provides language to put in employee contracts to make sure that they can all be treated legally as ministers, no matter what they actually do. The aim is to make sure that workplace protections against discrimination on the basis of things like race and sex and religion and sexual orientation, gender identity, age, disability, just don't apply to religious employers. Our cases are going to test whether they can get away with that. Finally, one more thing I want to tell you about. We've challenged a Trump administration healthcare regulation imposed on all hospitals and other healthcare facilities that receive federal funds. So that includes not just the folks who get research money, but anybody who accepts Medicare or Medicaid patients. The regulation says that any employee at those facilities has the right not to serve or treat or help or have anything to do with any patient if that worker has a religious objection either to the patient or to the medical procedure that the patient needs. So what does that mean? The intake clerk at the ER, the one who sits there at the desk and takes your insurance card, he can refuse to send you back to see the doctor if he has a religious objection to you because, you're Jewish or you're gay or you're married to somebody of a different race or whatever. Leave you sitting in the waiting room, and if that means you bleed out, it just does. I know that sounds crazy, but that's the thing. Or an example that the Trump administration specifically gave in the rule: an ambulance driver can refuse to transport a patient with an ectopic pregnancy whose life is at risk because saving her life might require an abortion. So just don't put her in the ambulance and take her in. And if the hospital wants to ensure that patients get the care that they need, if it says to its employees, look, if you have religious objections, just let us know so we can plan for that. Or else go get somebody else to help the patients you won't serve. Or look, that's all great and we respect and honor your objections, but in an emergency, sometimes it's all hands on deck. If they do any of that stuff, the Trump administration says it's punishable by denying federal funds and requiring the hospital to repay what's already received. So what does that mean? It means a public hospital has to let every employee, no matter who, interfere with and maybe altogether block patients from getting care, even in emergencies. Or if the hospital instead decides, for instance, to adopt reasonable policies to accommodate religious objections while still ensuring that patients get treated, the government is going to then bar it from taking Medicare and Medicaid patients, which means that they don't get treated. Working with the government of Santa Clara County, California, as well as colleagues at Lambda Legal and the Center for Reproductive Rights, we've already been successful in getting a federal trial court to throw out that regulation. The Trump administration is now trying to get the ruling reversed by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. And there's a similar case going on out of New York in the Second Circuit. We feel really good about what's going to happen on our cases. And we also hope that the Biden administration is going to agree with us about getting rid of this awful, atrocious, frankly, dangerous rule. But here's the thing. Look, we choose our cases incredibly carefully to try to uphold and advance the church-state separation and the protections for religious freedom that we all care so much about. It is tougher now than it was even just a few years ago because of where the federal courts are. I think that makes it all the more important to do this work and to do it really carefully and really well, and to be incredibly, ridiculously strategic about it. And also to use other means, pressing for new good laws and regulations, and mobilizing to try to make good law where we can and limit the risks of bad court decisions that would put all our rights in jeopardy. That's the threat and the opportunity right now. Rachel, do you want to pick up?
Thanks, Richard. That was a great kind of overview of just some of our legal work and some of the challenges that we're facing in the court. I'll just react for a moment, and then Cynthia, I'll give it over to you. And I do see some questions popping up. First of all, I just wanted people to notice how many of our cases these days are about government sanctioned religious discrimination. I mean, there's a lot of them, right? And second, I'd like people to notice how many fundamental things, rights we're talking about, and freedoms, and how many basics are being impeded with religious sort of exemptions, right? Everything and sort of free exercise of religion arguments, right? It's everything from your job, right? Like these cases that Richard was talking about in school teachers, right? People getting fired in the name of religious freedom. It's your access to healthcare, right? It's your ability to live your values and foster kids and help needy kids who don't have homes. I mean, it's really very fundamental stuff right now, and that's under attack on our issue. Third, I want to call attention to how very strategic the legal department is, right? I mean, these coupling of cases is really powerful, right? So being able to sue like we have on behalf of a lesbian couple in Texas, the Maroof case, who can't foster kids, right? Because the agency isn't letting them because they don't mirror the Holy Family because they're lesbians. And at the same time sue on behalf of a Catholic woman who is the wrong religion because she belongs to a parish instead of a Catholic church instead of a evangelical Protestant one. That coupling is really strategic and powerful, right? Because it shows like the breadth of what's at risk if you allow this type of religious discrimination. Same thing with the two cases on employment discrimination, in the name of religious freedom and ministerial exception, right? Like on the one hand, we have a lesbian woman who, by the way, is like the most acclaimed school counselor, like most acclaimed teacher at her school. People love her. She went to the school, and she's being fired. And then a guy who's claiming like a hostile work environment based on race is being fired. So, again, if you listen to Amy Coney Barrett in her hearing, and the Judiciary Committee, she always tries, even if you listen to the oral argument that just took place in this Fulton case that Richard described, Amy Coney Barrett is always trying to distinguish race. Well, I'm not talking about race. Like, no, we wouldn't, permit this in the case of race, but it is like, there isn't a line that you can draw once you permit, something in the name of religion, right? We've been there before, and here we are again. So I think it's a really wonderfully strategic approach that the legal department is taking with these couplings. And finally, just to encourage people that, not only does Americans United have lots going on outside of the legal department, right, to try to make good policy and prevent bad policy so it won't go to the courts, right, to try to grow this movement. We've been growing our outreach and engagement department. Our communications department is very strong. We're going to be doing all these like visibility campaigns to try to up our visibility and our issues visibility. But even in the legal department, you know, we're thinking hard, right? It's like, and this is just a fantasy at this point. We're not committed to it, but like, what would it look like for our legal department to do a legal academy, right? To train young lawyers, right? Maybe with some partners on religious freedom law, or even young lawyers in town at law firms or whatever, but really put them through something, get the funding and be able to put them through something so that we're helping to ensure that we have a bench of nominees someday that really understand our area. So there's tons for us to keep doing, as you can hear. And you know, we're vigilant and we have a lot to undo, but we're also feeling optimistic. So Cynthia, it is high time that we passed it back to you, and it's 8:46 or 7:46 your time. And I want to make sure there's time for us to respond to any questions.
Yeah, we do have questions. Hal pointed out if we're going to mirror the Holy Family, they'd have to be Jewish. And of course, I thought about if they'd have to be Jewish and have a child who was without sin. All right, I know Ed Wright, one of our board members, had a question. Ed, I'm going to unmute you, so you should be able to ask your question.
Yes.
Are you there?
Can you
Go.
I'll go? Yes. Very realistically, here in Missouri, we really are not going to elect somebody sympathetic to our views to a statewide office in the foreseeable future. We know what situation we're in and how red it is. There are some pockets in the state where we can have some success, but overall, we're not going to be very politically successful in Missouri. But there are a lot of situations with cases, legal situations, such as the "In God We Trust" motto. They want to put that in all of the public schools. And one thing that I observed was public high school teams doing prayers after a football game. In fact, at first it was led by the coaches. And when I noticed that, I reported to the school, our school, and they stopped that the next week. But now they still have the prayers, but the coaches stand 10 yards away, which is still a form of bullying, I think. So how can we expand our role, strengthen our role in attacking some of these type issues legally? Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you for being on with us tonight.
So Richard, I think I'll let you answer the legal. You just threw that legally in, Ed, at the end, and obviously we do bring these cases legally. Thinking of Bremerton, Richard, and I'm going to let Richard speak to the legal. I'll just say really quickly though that I think there's also a really important non-legal strategy here in Missouri. So I think number one, I think it's really important to expose who's funding these initiatives and what the full initiative is about, right? So these "In God We Trust" bills are part of Project Blitz, right? And Project Blitz is funded by 3 religious extremist groups, right? And it's also got a published agenda that we have, and we can certainly give you, we have fact sheets on Project Blitz, right? That demonstrate what the end goal is, right? The "In God We Trust" are phase 1. Then it goes to, you know, making sure that marriage is between a man and a woman. And then it goes to enabling discrimination in the name of religion. And so I think it's very important to sort of draw that line and make sure that you're educating your representatives and just influencers in different coalitions in the state that that's what's really underneath those "In God We Trust" bills. Also, I think it's very important to find faith voices to be able to speak out against these bills and who can sort of be a voice to communicate the message that we were just talking about, that these are really part of a bigger effort. At Americans United, we have a Faith Leaders United list, right, that has over 1,500 names, and we send out alerts. But we're also going to be unveiling in the winter our first ever National Faith Advisory Council. And, that's, I think, really important, right? So that we can demonstrate that and by the way, it's going to have plenty of Christians on it because that's important, right? We're still a majority Christian nation, and we need to be able to counter and, these initiatives by saying, this isn't what Christians are for church state separation, religious minorities are for church state separation, and non-believers are for church state separation. And frankly, our religious council is going to have kind of all that mixed up. And so I think finding religious voices is important, and finally, youth voices are important. I mean, this Generation Z, and we've seen what they did with Parkland and with gun violence prevention. They are on fire. They are full activists. My kids are Generation Z. And, I asked my son, like, what does it mean, Xander, to grow up with, like, you were born like dirt, like shortly before 9/11. Then there's been like climate crisis, gun violence crises, COVID, racial justice crises. Like what is, like, I know you've never known it any other way. And he was like, his answer was, honestly, I think my generation are political activists, like as a result of it. So I think, and I'm also proud to tell you that Americans United has launched our first ever youth organizing fellowship. It's super cool. We've always done the essay contest, which is great, but we know that we better be reaching and educating the new generation of leaders so they can carry the torch, right? And so we are now having a fellowship for 10 youth activists every year who we select, and we're very selective. I mean, they need to be leaders in their communities. They need to reach 1,000 young people throughout the year, but we train them as organizers. We train them on our issue. They're incredibly diverse in race and religion, non-believers, believers, geographically diverse. And so I think, for you too, in Missouri, like finding ways to work with youth and younger people, in addition to LGBTQ groups, reproductive freedom groups, racial justice groups, like all of the overlapping groups whose interests are at stake. Those are all things that you can do, even if you can't win right now on the bills. Richard,
Sure.
anything legal?
Yeah. And in fact, Ed, the issues, the particular questions you brought up are, I don't know if they're all about the schools, but certainly a lot of them are, which made me think of a couple of things I wanted to tell you. First of all, I suspect a lot of you know, but maybe not everybody does. So Americans United was founded in 1947 by folks in Kansas. Okay, so you're in Missouri. I grew up in Nebraska, but Kansas gets the credit. Who after World War II got worried because what there was a shortage of teachers in the public schools. And so what communities would do and school districts would do is they would borrow from whatever religious schools happen to be around the teachers, have them come in and teach in the public schools so that there would be a way to, get the kids teachers. And those teachers would come in and do things like they had done in whatever religious school they happened to come from. So it was kind of luck of the draw, what you got. The folks in Kansas were worried that that there would be, call it a mismatch between what your kids and your family believe and what was being taught in their classroom and in the public school because of who was available to teach. So they came to Washington and founded Americans United to try to deal with that problem. That means from day one, the public schools were always one of our most important things. When you take something like the coach-led prayer, which is a huge thing, and it's not a red state versus blue state phenomenon or anything else. It goes all over. I've discovered a couple of things. One of them is that more often than you would think, the school superintendent, the school board, those officials recognize both that they have legal duties to all the kids and actually care about respecting the beliefs of all the kids in their families. And so they try to put a stop to what the coach is doing, and the coach sues. One of the things that I that I love for us to be able to do and that we've done several times and continue to do, is to help school districts that are trying to do the right thing, to stand up in those cases and deal with the suits coming from the coaches and from the folks on the religious right who are supporting and funding those suits to protect the rights of all the students. That being said, look, there are also a lot of bad actors. One of the things that we do is, some of you will have heard from my colleague Ian, who gets complaints that people pass into us, investigates them, and sends out letters to ask for demand changes to violations. And he has a really high success rate by carefully explaining the law and saying, here's what you did wrong, and you need to fix it. So we do that. In the courts, absolutely too, but carefully to decide where are the chances that we can preserve the important law that's been made, to advance the law, not to lose things, and to use every tool, including things that will be arguments in cases that aren't about the religion clauses, but about different legal requirements altogether, that have the effect of protecting all those kids and families. So we're doing a lot of that, and I think more every day.
Yeah, it looks like someone asked a question about whether either of you have any comments on the recent speech by Justice Alito. You might want to mention what exactly the problem was with that speech.
Richard, do you want to start? Or you
No,
want me to-
that one's all you, Rachel. Please go ahead.
Okay. That's fine. Well, I put in the chat box a blog post that we wrote. So also be sure to click through so you can read that after. But I mean, it was truly problematic. Firstly, I mean, the legal philosophy that he shared was terrible. Just terrible on everything from, marriage equality, Obergefell and his views against that, to like Little Sisters of the Poor, and which was a case about the birth control religious exemptions. And he spoke as though religious freedom is under attack, that whole myth, when the court is so dominated by conservatives who want to redefine religious freedom. It's like backwards. And he also really inappropriately, it was so political, and he signaled how he was going to vote on matters that are truly coming before him as we speak. And actually, Richard, you could speak to if you want, and I'm happy to too, but I'll just say briefly, we've actually just filed 2 new amicus briefs in these cases that are going before the court, one on behalf of the Catholic Diocese and one some Orthodox synagogues and Orthodox Jewish groups that want religious exemptions to these large gathering bans in New York. And the court did rule on this before with some other sort of emergency rulings around Easter and before, and we actually won 5-4 with Justice Roth, with the chief voting with our side, saying no, religious freedom doesn't give you the right to risk lives. That's not what it's about. But now these 2 cases are literally before the court, and he basically signaled that he was going to rule in favor of the religious exemptions, which is really inappropriate and just part of this politicization of the court in the system of checks and balances, where it's supposed to be a balance on political systems, like lifetime appointments, etc. So it was deeply disturbing and also inappropriate.
Yeah, just a quick half a word. As Rachel said, we just filed 2 briefs in the Supreme Court, and we're up to about 40 briefs, amicus briefs nationwide, in cases where we are explaining that as difficult for people and for all of us as the mass gathering bans and the stay-at-home orders and all that stuff are, the rule for houses of worship and worship services ought to be the same as it is, whatever that is in a location ought to be the same as it is for other similar things. If you can't have concerts and lectures and public meetings like that, then you can't have worship services, and they should go together. That's what the Chief Justice agreed with us on, and the Supreme Court didn't have any patience for as recently as maybe 6 weeks ago or 8 weeks ago when it last decided. And now, as Rachel said, there are 2 cases up there with now the real possibility that the court could take the position that religious services and religious gatherings get special treatment that nobody else gets, even at the cost of people getting sick and infecting others and dying. Again, that should be crazy, but that's a real risk, and we'll see as early as maybe Friday or Saturday whether the court's position is changing.
And I think these cases really perfectly illustrate that what is being framed as religious freedom is really an ask for religious privilege, right? Like, give us special treatment, right? But they're calling it religious freedom. So these cases have, I think, actually been a good vehicle for us first to win on, right? We filed now 40 additional briefs in these cases. Thank you, Richard, and your department. It's an unbelievable additional amount of work. But so far, there have only been 3 cases where we filed these briefs where the court is found on the side of the religious exemption. So this is an area where we're winning and where we can really like demonstrate this quest for religious privilege in the name of religious freedom.
Great, thank you. We had one other comment that I thought was interesting. Someone was wondering about educational qualifications, such as for chaplains, having to have a seminary education in some instances. I'm not sure if that's an area that you guys have looked at all or taken any positions on.
Yeah, a little bit, although our colleagues, I would in a different era have said down the hall who do the policy work have done more with it. But yeah, look, what's supposed to happen there. By the way, the rule on chaplains that comes through from some cases going back to the 60s is, just so you know, because it can seem weird, the idea that there are government paid chaplains at all. The idea is supposed to be that in the military and in prisons and in state hospitals, kind of those 3 institutions where you're in there and you're separated from everything else. And so your ability to practice your own faith and find your faith community and house of worship and take advantage of them yourself, you might not be able to do. The military sends you off to a place where there just isn't that opportunity, that the military can deal with your free exercise right, can enable you to practice free exercise of your religion by having chaplains. And again, the rule has been the same thing in prisons and in state hospitals as in the military, but they're not supposed to be, but chaplains are supposed to serve everyone, not just people of their own faith. And they're not supposed to preach or they're not supposed to proselytize. They're supposed to, partly be counselors for everybody and partly be resources for everybody. And one of the things that's interesting in the kind of weird rules, and all of this should go for VA hospitals as well, one of the weird things about that is in sort of picking and choosing favored clergy and disfavored clergy and all of that, it kind of misses the basic principle that these folks aren't supposed to be representatives of their faith. They're supposed to be resources to everyone. So I think it's a real problem. I don't know exactly what to do about it. As I say, that's one that I would ask some of my colleagues, but you've put your finger on a serious question. Absolutely.
Yeah. Some of the chaplains I'm aware of who are Christian have set up Jewish services and Muslim services for their people, and that's really what their job's supposed to be, is to be there for everybody.
That's supposed to be the job. Absolutely. Yeah.
I noticed you sent in chat, you've got a Washington Post editorial that you wrote, if you would email me that, I can send that out to our chat. Because as soon as we turn this off, I think that goes away, as I understand.
Sure.
Zoom. So
Sure.
appreciate everybody joining us tonight. As Ed Wright pointed out, one of the things we can do even in Missouri is point out violations when we see them, speak out as individuals, let those school districts know we don't appreciate those things. If we want to do it officially through AU, we go to Washington and have them help us. But at any rate, appreciate your time, Rachel and Richard, and all the work you're doing. Hope we're seeing some brighter days and still a lot to tackle. So thanks again for joining us and for everyone for being with us.
Thanks for having us. And we appreciate your work too. We're really grateful you're all with us. So thank you.
All right, we'll